The last train west out of Boston left at 7:15 in the morning, and Clara Wren was on it before the city had finished waking up. She had not said goodbye to the room she'd rented on Archer Street, the one with the warped floorboard by the window and the landlady who knocked twice before entering, and always looked disappointed to find Clara still there. She had not said goodbye to the small office on Hanover where she'd kept ledgers for a dry goods merchant named Albright, who paid her $11 a month and occasionally forgot she existed for days at a time. She had said goodbye to her father's grave, though, that she had done properly standing in the cold April mud of Cedar Hill Cemetery, with her good shoes sinking slowly into the earth, holding nothing in her hands because she could not think what to bring. She had stood there a long time, long enough for the groundskeeper to look her way twice. Then she had walked to South Station, bought a ticket to Grayfall, Montana, and taken her seat in the second-to-last car. The ticket had cost her more than she had. The balance was a loan from Albright, who had seemed surprised to learn she was leaving, and more surprised to learn where she was going, and had written out the amount in his careful hand without asking her to explain herself, which she appreciated more than she could say. She would pay him back. She had written it in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, between the entry for her father's doctor and the entry for the burial. A column of debts, all of them honest, all of them hers. The letter was in her other pocket. She had read it so many times that the paper had gone soft at the folds, the way paper does when it has been handled by someone who cannot leave a thing alone. 2 pages. The handwriting was square, and even the letters formed with the kind of deliberate care that suggested a man who did not write often but took it seriously when he did. There were no flourishes. There were no exaggerations. There were several things crossed out and rewritten which she found more reassuring than if the letter had been clean. My name is Emmett Holt. I run a cattle operation outside Grayfall, Montana, which is a small town in the northern part of the state. The ranch is called Holt Ranch because my father built it, and I have not thought of a better name. I am 34 years old and in good health. I am looking for a wife who is willing to work alongside me and build something out here. I will not deceive you about what this is. The winters are long. The work is hard. I am not an easy man to know. But I am a fair one, and I will treat you with respect, and the land is honest, and it is mine. That was the first paragraph. The second explained the practical arrangements. Travel would be reimbursed. A ceremony could be arranged at the county office. Within a week of arrival, the house had 3 rooms and a proper stove and a well that did not go dry in summer. The third paragraph was the shortest. I read your advertisement in the Western Domestic Correspondent. You wrote that you were looking for a life with more ground under it. I thought that was an honest way to say it. I have ground. She had written back within the hour. She had not agonized over it. There was nothing to agonize over, really. The ground under her life in Boston had been going soft for 2 years long before her father died, long before the debts made it official. She had known for a long time that she was staying out of a kind of loyalty to a place that did not require her loyalty. Her father had understood that better than she had. He had told her in the last weeks, when words cost him something to say, that she had always been bigger than the life she'd settled for. He had not meant it as a criticism. He had meant it as permission. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the train window and watched Massachusetts go gray and then go flat. and then disappear entirely into the wide middle of the country. The train reached Grayfall in the early afternoon of the third day. Clara had slept badly and eaten little and spent most of the journey reading the same 3 pages of a novel she had brought and retained nothing from. She had also spent a considerable amount of time watching the landscape change outside her window, which was not something she had expected to find absorbing, but which turned out to be the most absorbing thing she had done in months. The east was green and crowded and stacked on top of itself. The west opened slowly like a fist unclenching until by the time they reached the Montana territory, there was so much sky that it looked painted on. Too much of it. More than seemed reasonable. She found this alarming and then gradually did not. Gray Falls Station was a single-room building with a wood stove and a hand-lettered sign above the door that said, Grayfall, and underneath it, in smaller letters, Pop 312. The platform was unpainted boards over bare earth. There were 2 horses tied to a post, a dog asleep in a patch of sun, and a boy of about 11 standing at the edge of the platform, holding a piece of pine board with her name written on it in what appeared to be charcoal. Miss Clara Wren. The boy had red hair and a serious expression, and he did not lower the sign when she approached him, which she respected. I'm Clara Wren, she said. Yes, ma'am. He lowered the sign. I'm Roy Adler. Mr. Holt sent me. She looked past the boy toward the street, which was a single dirt road lined with wooden storefronts and not much else. The afternoon light was very flat and very clear, and it made everything look like it had been cut out of something larger. Where is Mr. Holt? She asked. Roy's eyes went briefly to the side. He had some business to see to at the county office. He said to tell you he'd be back to the ranch by supper time, and you should go on ahead and make yourself comfortable. A pause. Mrs. Briggs is there. She'll see to things. Clara looked at the boy for a moment. He was doing a creditable job of meeting her eyes, but she had kept ledgers for 4 years, and she was good at reading the small adjustments people made when they were delivering a message. They hadn't been given enough information to explain. What kind of business? She asked. I don't rightly know, ma'am. She didn't press him. It was not the boy's fault, and in any case, she would find out. She was good at finding things out. All right, she said. Let's go. The road to Holt Ranch ran north out of Grayfall for 14 miles, following the line of a creek that Roy told her was called Willow Creek, though she could see it only in flashes between stands of cottonwood and willow that were just beginning to leaf out in the April cold. The wagon was a plain buckboard, and Roy drove it with the easy competence of a boy who had been doing it since he was 8. He talked when she asked him questions and went quiet when she didn't, which she found suited her. She asked him about the ranch. Big, he said with the economy of someone for whom size was self-evident. Mr. Emmett's been running it alone since his pa died last year. Had more hands before, but things got complicated. Complicated how? A pause. Legal-like. She did not ask him to say more. Legal-like could mean many things, and she preferred to gather her information in layers when she could. She asked him about Mrs. Briggs. Widow woman, he said. Got her own place 1/2 mile east of Holt's. Been neighborly to Mr. Emmett since his pa went. She's all right. He seemed to feel this warranted emphasis. She's real all right, Mrs. Briggs. The land rose as they went north, the flat of the valley giving way to long, rolling hills covered in bunch grass that was still winter pale. The mountains to the west were still carrying their snow, and the late afternoon light caught the peaks and turned them a color she did not have a word for, somewhere between copper and rose. She watched them as they rode and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Something that was the opposite of the closing in she had grown used to in Boston. The feeling of being very small in a very large place and finding that this was not frightening. Then she saw the ranch. It came into view as they crested a low rise, spread across the bottom of a shallow valley with a creek running silver along its eastern edge. The main house was large by any frontier standard, 2 stories with a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides, built from timber that had weathered to a gray-brown, the exact color of the hills behind it. There were 2 barns, both substantial, and a bunkhouse and a series of corrals that extended farther than she could clearly see. A kitchen garden was visible on the south side of the house, though the beds were overgrown, and the fence around them had 2 broken posts that leaned inward like old men in conversation. The scale of it was surprising. The maintenance of it was not what she would have expected from a place this size. Roy seemed to read her expression. "Mr. Emmett's been short-handed," he said with a kind of loyalty that required no elaboration. Mrs. Nell Briggs was standing at the kitchen stove when Clara came through the back door, and she turned without particular surprise, as though she had expected Clara at exactly this moment, and had arranged herself accordingly. She was a tall woman, somewhere in her middle 50s, with gray-streaked hair, pulled back in a practical knot, and a face that had clearly been pretty once, and was now something better, competent, kind, watchful in a way that didn't make you feel watched. "Miss Wren," she said, "or I suppose you'll be Mrs. Holt before the week's out." She did not make it a question. "I'm Nell Briggs. I've known Emmett since he was 12 years old, and I want you to know he's a good man, though he will not tell you so himself and might actively deny it if you ask him." Clara set her bag down on the kitchen floor. The kitchen was large and better appointed than she had expected. A proper iron stove, a long table of rough-hewn pine shelves along one wall, with enough preserved goods to suggest someone had been thinking about winter. The rest of the house, she would learn, was somewhat less organized, but the kitchen clearly received the most human attention. "How did you know I'd want to know that?" Clara asked. "Because it's the first thing a sensible woman wants to know," Nell said, and turned back to the stove. "Supper will be ready at 6. Emmett will be back by then. Sit down, and I'll put the kettle on." Clara sat. They drank tea at the long table, and Nell talked in the unhurried way of someone who understood that information given in the right order was more useful than information given all at once. She talked about the land, the winters which were serious, and the summers which were short, but extravagant. She talked about the town, who was reliable at what. She talked about the creek and the water rights and the way the snow came off the mountains in March and what it did to the lower pastures. She did not talk about the county business, and Clara did not ask, and in this way they established, without saying so, a kind of mutual respect that would serve them both going forward. At one point, Nell refilled their cups and said without particular inflection, "George Holt Emmett's father was one of the best men I've known in 40 years of knowing people. He died last spring, and Emmett has been navigating some difficulties since." She looked across the rim of her cup. "Nothing that won't sort itself out if it's given the right conditions." Clara met her eyes. "What kind of conditions?" Nell considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Stability, she said, and someone who doesn't rattle easy. Emmett Holt came back to the ranch at 6:20. Clara heard the horse first, then the sound of the barn door, and then a silence of about 15 minutes that she assumed was the time he needed to see to the animal before seeing to anything else. She had used those 15 minutes to carry her bag upstairs to the room Nell had indicated. A plain room with a washstand and a window that looked west toward the mountains, and to wash her face and hands and sit on the edge of the bed for a moment and do nothing but breathe. She was good at preparation. She had been preparing for difficult things her whole life. She came back downstairs with her face composed and her hands quiet, and the letter tucked back into her coat pocket. And she stood near the kitchen door when she heard his boots on the porch. He was taller than she had pictured. She wasn't sure why she had pictured him at the height. She had something about the plainness of the letter, maybe the absence of any quality that enlarged itself in the telling. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and he moved with the particular economy of men who work outdoors. No gesture wasted. No adjustment made without purpose. His face was weathered in a way that made his age hard to read. He could have been younger than 34 or older, depending on the light. He took off his hat when he came through the door, not theatrically, just as a matter of course, and hung it on the peg to the right of the door frame with the accuracy of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He looked at her. Not a long look. Not an appraising one, or rather, it was appraising, but it was the kind of appraisal that is interested in fact rather than judgment. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at fence lines and water levels and the color of the sky before a storm, taking stock. "Miss Wren," he said. "Mr. Holt." A beat of quiet. Not uncomfortable, it had substance to it. The way the quiet of an outdoor place has substance, as opposed to the nervous silence of rooms where people are waiting for someone to speak. "How was the train?" he asked. "Long," she said. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. It didn't quite become a smile, but it acknowledged the possibility of one. "Supper ready." Mrs. Briggs said 6 o'clock, and it's past that. She knows I'm never on time. He moved past her toward the washstand near the back door, and she noticed the set of his shoulders, not relaxed exactly, but settled. A man who was accustomed to his own skin. "I'll be 2 minutes." He was exactly 2 minutes. They ate supper with Nell, who carried the conversation with the skilled ease of a woman who had sat through many a silent meal and understood that silence properly managed was not a failure. The food was good. A beef stew with biscuits. The kind of meal that communicated competence without effort. Emmett ate steadily and without comment. Clara noted that his attention, when it moved across the table, tended to rest a half-second longer than social convention required, as though he was gathering information he would process later in private. She was doing the same thing. At one point, Nell said something about the spring calving, and Emmett responded with 3 sentences that contained more words than he had spoken in the rest of the meal combined. And Clara filed this away with the other things she was collecting. He spoke when something needed to be said. He did not speak to fill space. When supper was done, Nell gathered her shawl in her basket and announced she would be back the following morning, and the way she said it made it clear this was information rather than a request for permission. She paused at the kitchen door and looked at them both in a way that managed to be entirely free of sentiment, while somehow being full of feeling, and then she was gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Emmett poured himself a second cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. He did not offer her one first, and then he caught himself and said, "Coffee," and she said yes, and he poured it without fuss. They stood at opposite ends of the kitchen counter. Clara decided to say the thing she had been waiting to say since Roy had told her about the county office. "What is the business at the county office?" His hands did not move on his cup. This told her something. "A legal matter," he said. "My father's estate." "Is it serious?" A moment's pause. It could become serious. He looked at her over the rim of his cup direct and without evasion. "My brother Silas believes the ranch should be divided. I believe my father wanted otherwise. There will likely be a hearing." "When?" 6 weeks, maybe 8. Depends on the court schedule. Clara processed this. The ranch he had described in his letter. "The land is honest and it is mine" was not apparently entirely his. Not yet. Possibly not at all, depending on how a judge in a county courthouse decided to read a dead man's intentions. She said, "Does this affect the arrangement between us?" He considered this with the same serious attention he seemed to give everything. "The arrangement stands," he said. "Whatever happens with the land." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. "All right." He nodded back once with a finality that suggested the matter was settled to his satisfaction. They finished their coffee. He told her there was wood for the stove in her room if the night got cold, and that Roy would be around at first light to help with the morning work, and that she should feel free to move around the house as she saw fit. "It's your house too," he said. And the plainness of it, the complete absence of ceremony with which he said it, did something unexpected to the place just below her sternum. "Good night, Mr. Holt," she said. "Good night, Miss Wren." She went upstairs. She heard him move around the kitchen for a while, the sound of the stove being banged, the back door opening and closing once. Then quiet. She did not sleep for some time. She lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the wind off the mountains, which was a different wind than any she had heard before, lower and more continuous, like something that had been traveling a long distance and had not finished yet. She found the letter on her 8th day at the ranch. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for a wooden spoon which she had used the previous afternoon and which had disappeared in the way that things disappear in an unfamiliar house migrating to places logic doesn't predict. She opened the drawer to the left of the stove, then the one below it, then the wide flat drawer at the end of the counter that seemed to contain an assortment of objects with no clear relationship to one another. A horse brass, a length of twine, 3 nails, a small brass compass with a cracked face, and underneath all of this folded. Once a piece of paper. She would have closed the drawer. She was not a person who read other people's correspondence. But the paper was folded, not sealed, and when she picked it up to move it aside, she saw that it was not a letter. In the ordinary sense, it had no salutation, no address, and the handwriting was a woman's, not Emmett's. And the first line, visible even with the paper folded, read, "To whoever found this man." She stood in the kitchen for a moment with the paper in her hand. Then she unfolded it and read it. It was written by a woman named Augusta Fenner, who identified herself as the proprietress of Maplewood Station, a way station and overnight shelter situated 18 miles east of Denver on the Pikes Peak Road. The date at the top of the letter was December 1887. It was addressed to no one in particular and seemed to have been written without a clear destination in mind, as though the writer felt compelled to set down a record of what had happened, regardless of whether the record ever reached anyone. The letter described the arrival on the afternoon of December the 4th of a man who had been brought in by a young cowboy traveling north. The man, she wrote, had been found unconscious on the roadside, his horse gone, his coat torn, a wound at the back of his skull, and a second wound at his right shoulder that suggested he had been struck several times and deliberately. He was a commercial traveler of some kind. There were samples in the saddlebag, recovered nearby fabric swatches, and a small leather notebook with figures in it. He had been beaten and robbed. The cowboy who brought him in had stayed 2 days. He had helped move the injured man, had sat with him through the first night, had refused payment of any kind. When the station master's wife, Mrs. Fenner herself, had asked his name, he had said only that he was from up north and that his name didn't signify. When the injured man had begun to show signs of recovery on the morning of the second day, the cowboy had saddled his horse and ridden on before the man was conscious enough to ask after him. He was young, Mrs. Fenner had written, not more than 26. He wore a dun canvas coat, and he had the look of the mountains about him, which is a quality I have come to recognize in men raised in the high country. Something careful in the eyes, something that does not waste its attention. He told me nothing about himself except that he had a long ride still ahead of him going north. I asked him why he had stopped for a stranger, and he said he didn't know how a man could do otherwise. The man he rescued recovered. His name is recorded in my register. If this letter ever reaches the man who helped him, I want him to know you saved a life that December. The man had a daughter, he said, when he could speak again. He talked about her quite a bit. I thought the man who kept him alive ought to know that. The letter ended there. Clara read it twice. She read it standing at the kitchen counter with the wooden spoon forgotten entirely. Then she folded it along its original creases and placed it back in the drawer beneath the horse brass and the twine. She stood at the counter for a long moment, her hand on the drawer, looking at nothing in particular. December 1887. Her father had made a commercial trip to Denver in the autumn of that year. She had been 19, and she remembered it because he had come back. Changed in some way she hadn't been able to name, quieter and more deliberate and with a habit he hadn't had before. Every evening, without explanation, he had lit a candle at the kitchen table and sat with it for a few minutes before going about the rest of his night. When she had asked him why, he had said only that it was a kind of gratitude. She had assumed he meant church gratitude, the general kind, and had not pressed him. He had done it for 8 years, until the night he could not get out of bed anymore. She had thought of it as a habit of his old age, the way old men sometimes acquired small rituals. She had not thought of it as specific, as pointed towards something, as the way a man might keep a vigil for a stranger he would never be able to thank. She moved to the window above the kitchen sink and looked out at the corrals where Emmett was working with a young horse, running it on a long lead in slow, patient circles. He moved with it as it moved the rope in his left hand, making small adjustments, his body language saying the same thing over and over, in a language the horse could read. He would do this for an hour. He had done it the previous 2 mornings as well. He seemed to believe that patience was a form of argument. A man from up north, not more than 26, going home. The timeline lived cleanly in her mind and she could not make it fit another shape no matter which way she turned it. December 1887. A dun canvas coat, the high country in his eyes. The young horse in the corral suddenly shied at something, a shadow or a sound, and Emmett brought the rope in close and held his ground while the animal settled. He did not back away. He did not make a sudden movement. He simply stayed where he was and waited for the horse to understand that the world was still the same world it had been before the fright. She watched him for a while. Then she went back to what she was doing. That evening after supper was the first time she saw the candle. She had been upstairs for an hour when she realized she had left her reading glasses on the kitchen table. She came back down the stairs quietly, not wanting to intrude, and stopped at the bottom of the staircase when she saw the kitchen. Emmett was sitting at the long pine table with a single candle burning in a tin holder in the center of the table. He was not reading. He was not doing anything in the ordinary sense. His hands were at rest, his coffee cup set to one side, his eyes on the flame with the particular unfocused attention of a man who is thinking about something that cannot be resolved by thinking harder about it. He did not hear her on the stairs. She stood there long enough to understand what she was looking at, and then she went back up to her room without her glasses. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about her father's kitchen in Boston, the yellow circle of light on the table, the way he had sat with it in just that way. Not praying exactly, not performing anything, just sitting with whatever it was he owed to, whoever it was he owed it to. She had not brought a candle of her own. She had not thought to. But she went to the washstand and found a stub of tallow left by whatever previous occupant the room had held, and she lit it from the lamp on the dresser, and she set it on the windowsill, and she sat with it for a while in the dark. Outside, the mountains held their snow. The wind moved through the grass below the window with the same low continuity she had been falling asleep to for 8 days now, and which she was beginning quietly to recognize as the sound of the place itself. Not silence, but something more honest than silence. A kind of voice that did not require an answer. She did not understand yet the full shape of what she was inside of. She only knew that the distance between the candle on the table downstairs and the candle on her windowsill was smaller than the distance between Boston and Montana, and that this seemed to matter in a way she could not yet articulate. After a while, the candle burned down. She went to sleep. In the morning, she found the wooden spoon in the pot rack above the stove, which was the last place she would have thought to look, and which was, she was coming to understand, entirely consistent with the logic of this house and the man who lived in it. Things were where they were for reasons that were not always visible. You had to learn the house slowly on its own terms. She was beginning to think this was true of more than the house. 3 weeks into her life at Holt Ranch, Clara understood several things she had not understood before. She understood that the corrals were the center of the property in a way the house was not. That the real work of the place happened there, and in the barns and along the fence lines that stretched north into the hills, and that the house was where Emmett slept and ate and little else. She understood that Roy Adler, who came every morning at first light and left at dark, was not simply a hired boy, but something closer to Emmett's conscience about the state of things. Roy noticed what needed doing, and said so plainly, and Emmett listened to him with a seriousness that he did not always extend to grown men. She understood that Nell Briggs's daily appearances were not the product of nosiness, but of a kind of determined love that had learned to wear the costume of practicality because that was the only costume Emmett would accept. And she understood, without having confirmed it, that the letter in the kitchen drawer had not put itself there. Someone had kept it. Someone had considered it worth keeping. And the only person who lived in this house was Emmett Holt. She did not ask him about it directly. She was not sure yet whether she had the right to, not the social right, which was a simpler question, but the deeper right, the one that comes from knowing enough about a person to understand what a question will cost them to answer. She did not know enough about Emmett yet. She was working toward it. What she knew so far, he was awake before sunrise every morning. And this was not discipline, but nature. The way some people are built to run toward sleep and others toward light. He ate what was put in front of him without preference except for strong coffee, for which he had a genuine need that was not a habit, but a requirement. He was better with animals than with people. Not because he lacked feeling, but because animals were honest about what they needed, and people frequently were not. And he found dishonesty, even the small social kind, the kind deployed out of politeness, genuinely difficult to navigate. He had a half-healed cut along his left palm from a piece of wire fence he'd grabbed too quickly in February, and sometimes, when he was thinking hard about something, he would run his thumb along the line of it without seeming to notice he was doing so. She noticed. She was discovering the kind of person who noticed things she had previously had nothing worth noticing. Boston had been a city of surfaces. Everything here had depth if you were willing to look at it long enough. She went to Nell Briggs on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week with a jar of the preserves she'd put up over the weekend as her reason for visiting, and a question she hadn't decided yet whether to ask. Nell's house was smaller than the Holt main house and considerably better organized, which told Clara something about the relationship between order and solitude. A woman alone maintained things differently than a man alone. Clara had noticed this before in Boston, but here it seemed more legible, as though the land amplified everything. Nell made tea, and they sat at her kitchen table, which was round and positioned near a window that looked east toward the Holt property. The light was good. "You've settled in," Nell said. It was not a question. "I'm learning the house," Clara said. "The house has its own logic. Emmett built the top 2 rooms himself after his mother died. He was 16. George told him the dimensions, and he figured out the rest." Nell wrapped both hands around her cup. He was always better at doing than at being told. Clara had known men like that. She had also known men who described themselves as better at doing than at being told, and were in fact simply resistant to instruction. Emmett was the former kind, which was a different thing entirely. She drank her tea. Outside, a meadowlark was making its case to the morning from somewhere in the grass. Then she said, "I found a letter in a kitchen drawer from a woman at a way station outside Denver, December of 1887. Nell's hands did not move on her cup. This, Clara had learned, was how Nell registered significance, not by reaction, but by the precise absence of it. "Did you?" Nell said. "I didn't go looking for it. I want you to know that. I believe you." Clara waited. Nell set down her cup. She looked out the window toward the Holt property for a moment, and Clara had the sense of watching someone make a decision about how far a door should be opened. Not whether to open it, but how much. and whether the person on the other side was the right person for what was behind it. George Holt told me that story, Nell said finally. The winter before he died. He was not well enough to work anymore, and sometimes he would sit with me in the evenings and talk the way people do when they know they are running short of time and want to spend what's left of it on things that are true. She paused. He said he wanted someone outside the family to hold the story, in case Emmett went before he got the chance to tell it to anyone. A small breath. George was a thoughtful man. He worried about things most men don't think to worry about. He told you what happened in Denver. He told me what he knew of it, which was not everything. Emmett never told the full story, not even to his father. George pieced it together from what Emmett said and what Emmett didn't say, which in some ways was more informative. Nell turned back from the window. Emmett was 26. He'd been down to sell a string of horses. There was a buyer in Denver who paid good prices, and the trip was worth the ride. He was on his way back north in early December, maybe 3 days out of Denver, and he came across a man on the roadside. Clara had not moved. The man had been beaten and robbed. His horse was gone. It was cold, not the worst of the winter yet, but cold enough that a man left unconscious on an open road in early December would not see morning. Nell spoke carefully, the way a person speaks when recounting something they have held for a long time and want to get right. Emmett brought him to the nearest shelter, which was a way station on the Pikes Peak Road. He stayed with him 2 nights. He would not give his name. He left before the man recovered consciousness. Why wouldn't he give his name? Nell was quiet for a moment. George believed it was because Emmett had some trouble in Denver that year. Not criminal trouble, George was clear on that, but trouble of the kind that involves another man's wife and the husband finding out. He did not want to be found. He needed to get north and not be followed. Clara absorbed this. It fit. It fit the way the crossed-out lines in his letter had fit the way the economy of his speech fit a man who had learned the hard way that words and names were things that could be used against you if you deployed them carelessly. The woman at the way station wrote it all down, Clara said. Augusta Fenner. Yes. She found correspondence in the saddlebag enough to trace the injured man to Boston, and she wrote to him there describing what had happened and who had helped him. The injured man wrote back to thank her. She kept his letter, too. And when George Holt passed through Maplewood the following spring, she recognized the description of the cowboy and sent George a copy, thinking the family ought to know. Nell paused. George kept it. He showed it to Emmett eventually. Emmett read it and put it in the kitchen drawer, and did not speak of it again. But he kept it. He kept it. The meadowlark had gone quiet. The morning had warmed to the particular stillness that precedes a working day, the last moment of neutrality before everything becomes purposeful and forward-moving. The man in the letter, Clara said. Her voice was level. She had practiced levelness her whole life, and she was grateful for it now. Did George know his name? Nell looked at her steadily. The letter said he recovered, that he was a commercial traveler, that he talked about a daughter he had when he was well enough to talk. A pause, measured and deliberate. George kept the letter, but he didn't know the man's name. Augusta Fenner didn't record it in what she sent. Another pause. But Emmett knew. The kitchen was very quiet. Emmett knew because Nell continued. When you placed your advertisement in the Western Domestic Correspondent, your name was given as Clara Wren, formerly of Boston, daughter of the late Dawson Wren commercial traveler. And Emmett had seen that name before. Clara looked at the table. "The notebook," she said. "The leather notebook from the saddlebag, with figures in it." George thought so. He never asked Emmett directly, but he thought so. Dawson Wren. In a small leather notebook in her father's careful hand, the name written inside the front cover. The way he wrote it in all his things. A habit from his years as an apprentice clerk when notebooks were expensive and required labeling. D. Wren, Boston. She had found 23 of those notebooks in his room after he died, stacked by year in the wardrobe, and she had sat on the floor of his bedroom and looked at them for a long time before she could bring herself to touch them. She thought about the advertisement she had placed. She had written her own name and her father's name because the correspondence form had asked for next of kin, and she had filled it in honestly, as she filled in all forms. She had not thought about what those words might mean to someone reading them from a distance of 8 years and several hundred miles. She thought about the letter she had received in return. 2 pages square handwriting, crossed out lines. "I have ground." He had known who she was. She rode back to the ranch slowly, letting the horse set its own pace on the familiar road. The morning was bright now, the kind of high, clear day that the Montana spring produced without warning, as though to compensate for how many days it withheld. The creek ran loud in its banks from the snowmelt, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first real leaves, small and yellow-green, and trembling in the light wind. She did not know what to do with what she knew, not yet. She unsaddled the horse and turned her into the paddock and stood at the rail for a while, watching the animal lower its head to the new grass. The day had its own momentum. There were things that needed doing. The kitchen garden had been waiting on her for a week. Roy had mentioned the south fence line needed walking, and she was the kind of person who found forward motion clarifying. She would work. She would think while she worked, which was how she did her best thinking. She went to the garden. She had been working for perhaps 40 minutes, pulling the dead growth from the beds along the eastern edge, when she heard boots on the path behind her. She did not turn around. Emmett crouched down beside her without speaking. He looked at what she had done, and then he reached in and began pulling the dead stalks from the adjacent bed with the same steady thoroughness she was applying to her own. He did not ask if she wanted help. He did not announce that he was helping. He simply helped. They worked like that for a long time. The sun moved. A pair of red-tailed hawks made long, slow circles above the South P pasture. At some point, Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the progress they'd made, and felt something she recognized as the specific satisfaction of visible work, the kind that leaves a mark you can see. Emmett was looking at the same progress. His profile was difficult to read at the best of times, but there was something in the set of his jaw that was different from his working expression, something quieter and further in. Then he said without looking at her, "My father also had that habit. The candle." She went still. "He started it the winter of 1887, Emmett said. "After I came home from Denver." He pulled a fistful of dead grass from the base of the nearest bed and set it aside. "He never explained it to me. When I asked, he said it was a kind of keeping faith. I didn't understand what he meant then." A hawk cried somewhere above them, one sharp sound. When did you understand it? Clara asked. His thumb moved along the scar on his left palm. Later, he said. The word contained more than it appeared to. They worked in silence for another hour, and it was the easiest silence she had spent in this place or anywhere in recent memory. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who understand without having discussed it, that what is between them does not require constant narration. The letter from Silas Holt's attorney arrived on a Thursday, and Emmett read it at the kitchen table while his coffee went cold beside him. Clara was at the counter when he read it. She watched him in her peripheral vision the way she had learned to watch things here, not directly, but with the patience that allowed for real observation. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his shirt. And he picked up his coffee cup and then set it back down without drinking from it, and he stood and went to the window and looked out at the corrals for a long time. Silas has filed formally, he said without turning around. When is the hearing? 5 weeks now. He turned then, and she saw the thing he was carrying, not fear exactly and not anger. Something more complicated than either. The particular weight of a man watching something he has built being assessed by people who did not build it. His attorney is calling you as a witness. She had expected this. She had not expected the directness with which he said it. What does he want from me? He wants to establish that our arrangement is one of convenience. That I brought you out here for appearances, not for a real marriage. He met her eyes. He's not wrong about the origins of it. He's not entirely right either, she said. Something shifted in his expression, slight but perceptible. He had not expected her to say that. I'm not going to ask you to lie, he said. I want to be clear on that. I know you're not. She turned back to what she was doing at the counter. I wouldn't lie anyway. That's not why I came here. A pause. Why did you come here? She considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, not the easy answer, but the true one, which was more complicated. Because the life I had didn't have enough ground under it, she said. That's what I wrote in the advertisement, and I meant it. I came here for a real life, not a comfortable one. Those are different things. She was quiet for a moment. I believe you know that better than most people. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, the hearing may not go the way I want it to. I understand that. You should know that whatever happens with the land, your position here is not contingent on it. I'll be straight with you about the finances if it comes to a sale. You'd have options. She looked at him then, squarely. Mr. Holt, I'm not here because I expect things to go well. I'm here because I've decided to be here. A beat. I'd appreciate it if you credited me with that. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded the same single nod she had come to recognize as his full agreement, more emphatic in its economy than a speech. Silas Holt appeared at the ranch 3 days later, unannounced. He arrived on a good horse and in a town suit, and Clara recognized from 20 yards that he was a man who had learned a long time ago to use his physical presence as an argument. He was built like Emmett, the same height, similar breadth, but where Emmett's size was simply what it was. A functional fact, Silas wore his with deliberateness the way a man wears a good hat for a specific occasion. Emmett was in the north pasture. Clara was in the yard when the horse came through the gate and Silas dismounted and tipped his hat with the particular courtesy that is a form of assessment. Mrs. Holt, he said. He used the name precisely the way a lawyer uses a term whose exact meaning he is disputing. "Mr. Holt," she said. She had decided she would not be the one to distinguish between them. He looked around the yard with the appraising eye of a man cataloging what is his and what he intends to make so. Then he looked back at her with the directness that she supposed he considered charming, or at least useful. "You seem like an intelligent woman," he said. "So I'll speak plainly. Please. My brother brought you here for a purpose, and the purpose was to make himself look more settled than he is. I don't hold that against him. It's what I would have done in his position. But the court will see it clearly, and I think you know that." He paused. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to ask if you know the full picture of what you've walked into." She looked at him without expression. "Do you know the full picture of what you're walking into, Mr. Holt?" His eyes sharpened. "I know my father's land and what it's worth." "Then you and your father's land deserve each other," she said, pleasantly, "and I think we're done here." She could see him recalibrate. He had expected several possible responses, and this was not among them. He recovered quickly. He was good at that, she could tell. And he smiled, and the smile was genuine enough to be interesting. "You're different than I expected," he said. "Most things are," she said. She went inside and let him stand in the yard, and she heard his horse leave about 3 minutes later, which was how long it took a man like Silas to decide whether he had lost the exchange or simply deferred it. She thought deferred. She thought that's fine. That evening, Clara could not sleep. She had known she wouldn't. She had known since Emmett had told her about the hearing maybe before. She lay in her room with the window open 2 inches, the cold mountain air moving the curtain in slow intervals. And she looked at the ceiling and let the question she had been carrying for 2 weeks settle into its full weight. In the morning, she would be capable as she always was. She would work the garden and keep the books and ride the fence line with Roy and do the things that were hers to do. But tonight in the dark, she allowed herself to be uncertain. It was a luxury she permitted herself, rarely uncertainty, but she had learned that refusing it entirely was another kind of dishonesty. The question was not whether she would tell the truth at the hearing. She would tell the truth. That was not in question. The question was which truth. Not in the dishonest sense, not a truth selected to mislead, but in the way that all real situations contain more than one true thing, and the one you lead with is a choice. She could say this began as a practical arrangement. We corresponded because we both had need of something the other could provide. The marriage was conducted at a county office without ceremony. There is no history of feeling between us, and feeling itself is not currently present in any form that I can speak to with confidence. All of this was true. Or she could say, I am here because I chose to be here, and I stay because I have found in this place and this man something that answers to something in me, and that is the beginning of something real, even if it is only the beginning. I do not call this love because I do not know it well enough yet to give it a name. But I know that it is not convenience. This was also true. The difference between the two answers was not the difference between honesty and dishonesty. It was the difference between describing a thing as it started and describing it as it is becoming. And she did not know, lying in the dark, whether the choice between them was hers to make on the basis of what she wanted or on the basis of what she could in conscience stand behind in front of a judge and mean. She thought about what her father had said, the last thing of consequence he had said, his voice gone thin and precise, spending each word carefully. Live larger than I did, Clara. The world is bigger than what I showed you of it. He had not been a large man, Dawson Wren. He had not been a small one either. He had been honest about what he had and realistic about what he lacked. And he had loved her with the specific love of a father who sees his child clearly and finds nothing to be ashamed of in what he sees. She had not always made it easy for him. She had been a difficult child in the way that intelligent and underoccupied children are. Difficult always asking the question after the one that was asked, always wanting to know the reason behind the rule. He had never punished her for it. He had answered when he could and admitted when he couldn't. And she had learned from this that honesty and knowledge were not the same thing, and that a person could be entirely honest and still not know what they were looking at. She thought about the candle. His candle burning every evening in Boston. Emmett's candle, or rather his father's. And then his burning every evening here. Two flames pointing toward each other across 8 years and half a continent, neither of them knowing there was anything on the other end. She thought he knew my name. She thought he wrote to me anyway. She thought about what Nell had said. He wouldn't give his name, he said his name didn't signify. And she thought about what it meant that a man who believed his name didn't signify had looked up from a newspaper advertisement 8 years later and seen that name, her father's name, and reached for paper and pen. What does a man like that mean when he reaches for paper and pen? She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and let the question sit without forcing an answer. At first light, she went downstairs. Emmett was already at the stove. He heard her on the stairs and turned, and something about the hour and the particular quality of the early light gray and even the mountains just beginning to surface from the dark made the kitchen feel different from how it felt in full day. Closer. Less mediated. She poured herself coffee and stood across the kitchen from him. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I'd like you to answer me honestly, even if the answer is complicated." He waited. "Did you know who I was before you wrote to me?" The question sat in the kitchen between them. He looked at her for a long moment, his coffee cup in both hands, his face doing the thing it did when he was deciding not what to say, but how much. Then he set the cup down on the counter. "Yes," he said. She had known. She had known. And the confirmation still landed with its full weight. "You saw my father's name in the advertisement. In the subscriber's notation. They list the father's name for unmarried women. I saw Dawson Wren, Boston." His voice was even and careful, the same voice he used on the difficult horses. "I recognized it. From the notebook." "From the notebook." A pause. "His name was inside the front cover. I'd read it 100 times in 2 days while I was keeping that notebook dry." He looked past her for a moment toward the window. I had spent 8 years not knowing if he'd lived. The kitchen was very quiet. "He lived," she said. "He lived until 2 years ago." Something moved through Emmett's face that she could not name precisely. It was not grief, and it was not relief, and it was not quite either of the things between them. It was the look of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told that the thing the weight was for had meaning. "I'm glad," he said. The simplicity of it was absolute. He didn't know your name, she said. He looked, I think, in his way. He didn't know how to find you. He lit a candle every night for 8 years. He called it a kind of keeping faith. She stopped. I thought it was a general thing. I didn't know it was pointed at something. Emmett's thumb moved along the scar on his palm. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. When I arrived. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I didn't want you to come here because of what I'd done for your father. I didn't want you to stay because of it either. I wanted... He stopped. Started again more carefully. I thought if you knew you'd feel you owed something. And I didn't want that. I wanted you to have the choice free. She looked at him across the kitchen in the early gray light. So you kept a secret to protect my freedom, she said. Yes, that's a very complicated way to be honest. I know it. A long moment passed. Outside, the light was shifting the gray, beginning to warm at the edges. Mr. Holt, she said. Emmett, he said. I think at this point it's Emmett. Emmett? She picked up her coffee cup. I'm going to tell the truth at that hearing. My own truth, not a convenience, not a story shaped to win a case. The truth as I understand it, which is that this marriage began as a practical matter and has become something I cannot describe yet with any word I'm confident of, but which is real. She looked at him. I don't know if that will be enough to satisfy a judge. It'll be enough, he said. Whatever a judge decides. She nodded. Then she said, You saved my father's life. The morning light was reaching the mountains now, catching the snow on the high faces, and beginning the slow daily work of turning the world from gray to gold. He was on the road, Emmett said. I stopped. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not nothing. They drank their coffee in the shifting light, and outside the ranch came a wake around them, the sound of horses moving in the corrals. Roy's wagon on the road from town. The meadowlarks staking their territorial claims to the brightening morning. The day had its own momentum, as days always do, and they would move into it presently, and work. And the work would be good, and the land would be honest, and the creek would run in its banks with the melt of the high snow. But for a few minutes they stood in the kitchen with their coffee on either side of a distance that was not so large as it had been, and let the morning come in at its own pace. The hearing was on a Wednesday, and it did not go the way anyone had predicted, which is what hearings generally do when the people inside them are telling the truth. Clara had prepared for it the way she prepared for difficult things, not by rehearsing what she would say, but by becoming as clear as possible about what she believed. She had sat in her room the night before, with the lamp turned low, and worked through it slowly, the way she worked through a ledger when the columns refused to balance. Going back to first principles, checking each entry against the original transaction. What was true? What she could stand behind? What she owed to accuracy and what she owed to herself. She had arrived at something she could hold. The courthouse in Grayfall was a single-room building that served also as the county recorder's office, and on Tuesdays as a polling location. Judge Avery Cade was a man of about 65 who had been on the bench long enough to have seen most of what human nature produces under pressure, and who regarded the proceedings before him with the mild and practiced attention of someone who has learned to listen for the thing beneath the thing being said. Silas Holt sat at one table with his attorney, a young man from Billings named Ferris, who had good suits and fast speech. Emmett sat at the other table with a local man named Dalton who was slower and quieter, and whom Clara suspected was more than adequate. She sat in the gallery. Roy was beside her. Nell was not present, which Clara had noticed, and which she understood Nell had done what she needed to do elsewhere. And a courtroom was not where the real things in this matter would be resolved. The morning went as legal mornings go, slower than necessary, more formal than the occasion seemed to warrant, with a great deal of attention paid to documents and precedent, and the precise language of a will written by a man who had tried to be clear and had not anticipated that clarity would become a point of contention. George Holt's will left the ranch to Emmett, with the provision that Silas retain right of first purchase should Emmett ever elect to sell. Silas's attorney argued that this provision implied co-ownership of intent. Emmett's attorney argued that it implied the opposite. Judge Cade listened to both arguments with the same expression. Then Clara was called. She walked to the front of the room and sat in the chair indicated, and looked at the judge rather than at either of the brothers, which she had decided was the right approach. She was not here to perform for Silas or to reassure Emmett. She was here to say what was true. Ferris, Silas's attorney, asked his questions quickly, and with the confidence of a man who believes momentum is a form of argument. Was the marriage conducted at a county office? Yes. Within 1 week of her arrival, yes. Had she known Emmett Holt prior to the correspondence that preceded the marriage? Num. Was the marriage the product of a published advertisement in a domestic correspondence journal? Yes. Mrs. Holt, he said, with a slight emphasis on the name that was meant to imply its own answer. Would you describe this as a conventional marriage? Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the judge. I would describe it as a real one, she said. I'm not sure those are the same thing, and I think you know that, or you wouldn't be asking me to distinguish between them. A small silence in the room. Could you elaborate? Judge Cade said, not unkindly. This marriage began as a practical arrangement, Clara said. I needed a life with more stability than I had. Mr. Holt needed, I think a judge can understand this without me stating it plainly, a household that looked settled, because he was anticipating exactly this kind of challenge to his claim. She paused. Both of those things were true when I arrived. Neither of them is the full picture of what the marriage is now. And what is it now? The judge asked. She thought about the kitchen in the early morning, the garden, the silence that had weight in it, the candle. It is two people who have decided to be honest with each other, she said, and who are finding out what grows from that. I cannot tell you it is love in the way a novel describes love. I can tell you it is real in the way a working ranch is real, because it takes work, and because what it produces is visible, and because neither of us is here for any reason other than that we have each decided this is where we belong. She looked at Ferris when she was done. He had lost something in his expression, some small certainty he had arrived with and had not yet recalculated to fill the space. No further questions, he said. Emmett's attorney declined to question her. He had been practicing long enough to know when a thing had already done everything that needed doing. Judge Cade ruled that afternoon briefly, and without drama, that the will as written was sufficiently clear to honor. and that right of first purchase did not constitute co-ownership. He noted in passing that the character of those who maintained the property was not legally relevant but was personally persuasive, and that, in his experience, people who told complicated truths under oath were generally telling them. Silas received this outcome in the particular stillness of a man who has lost a thing he has argued himself into believing was already his. He did not look at Emmett when it was over. He looked briefly at Clara, and what was in his face was not resentment but something more difficult, the look of a man confronting the distance between the story he has told himself and the actual shape of events. Outside the courthouse in the flat afternoon light, Clara waited while Emmett spoke briefly with Dalton. Roy had gone to bring the wagon around. The street was quiet in the way of small towns in the middle of a working day, when everyone who has somewhere to be is there. She thought about what Silas's face had held in that last moment. She thought about how long a man could sustain an argument against the evidence of things. She thought that the distance between Silas and whatever peace was available to him was not in the end a matter of land. 2 days after the hearing, Emmett rode to Silas's property alone. Clara did not know he had gone until Roy mentioned it in passing, and she did not ask Roy what for, because she thought she understood without being told. She understood it the way she was coming to understand many things about Emmett. Not because he explained himself, but because if you paid attention over enough time, the logic of a man's character became its own kind of language. She was in the kitchen garden when he returned the late afternoon sun, long and level across the yard, throwing the shadows of the fence posts in parallel lines across the turned earth. She heard his horse and looked up and watched him dismount and lead the animal toward the barn with the particular quiet of a man who has done a difficult thing and is processing the having done it. She waited. He came to the garden while there was still good light. He stood at the fence and looked at the work she'd done. The beds were largely cleared now, the broken posts replaced the winter-dead growth turned under. And then he looked at her. "I went to see Silas," he said. "I know." He leaned on the fence post with his forearms looking out over the garden rather than at her. "I offered him co-management rights on the eastern section. Not ownership. Management, which means he has input on what we do with the lower pastures and the creek access, and he has a legitimate reason to be here when he wants to be." She pressed her hands into the soil to clear them of dirt. "What did he say?" "Not much. He sat with it for a while." Emmett's thumb moved along the fence rail. "Then he asked why. What did you tell him?" He was quiet for a moment. The light was going gold now, long and thin, catching the tops of the grass in the south pasture. "I told him that my father didn't build this place so it could be a reason for his sons to be strangers to each other." He paused. "I told him I'd rather lose some ground than lose everything that the ground is supposed to mean." Clara looked at him. "He didn't say yes," Emmett added, "but he didn't say no." "He'll say yes," she said. "Maybe." "He will." She stood and brushed the earth from her knees. "He's been fighting because fighting felt like the only available motion. You just showed him there's another one." She picked up her gloves from the fence rail. "That's all most people need. Someone to show them the other motion is possible." He looked at her with the focused attention he reserved for things that surprised him. She had noticed over the weeks that he was not often surprised, and that when he was interested in it rather than unsettled by it. "How do you know that?" he asked. My father was a commercial traveler, she said. He spent 20 years talking to people who decided something wasn't possible. Most of them just needed someone to take the thing seriously enough to ask about it differently. A beat of quiet. The meadowlarks were doing their evening accounting in the grass below the fence line. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Emmett said. He was, she said. He was exactly that. That night, she wrote the letter she had been composing in pieces for weeks. Not a letter to send anywhere. A letter to her father, the kind that is written not to be received, but to be said because some things require the discipline of address before they can be understood by the person doing the writing. She had done this before once when she was 23, and there was something she needed to tell him that she did not know how to say aloud. She had written it and burned it, and found that the burning was the point. She sat at the small desk in her room and wrote steadily for an hour. She wrote about Boston and the train and the flat unfolding of the country through the window. She wrote about the ranch, how it looked from the rise on the road in and how different it looked once you were inside it. She wrote about Nell and Roy and the kitchen and the garden. She wrote about Emmett. Not about the history, not yet, but about the mornings, the coffee, the way he moved around the horses, the scar on his palm, the candle on the table. She wrote about the letter from Augusta Fenner and what she had understood when she read it, and what she had felt, which was not what she had expected to feel. She had expected something decisive, shock or grief, or the particular relief of a thing clicking into place. What she had felt instead was something quieter, something closer to recognition. The sense of arriving somewhere she had not known she was traveling toward. She wrote about the candle he lit every evening. She wrote he kept faith with you the only way available to him, which was to keep it in the dark and not ask anything of it. I think you would have understood that better than anyone. She wrote, I cannot tell you what this will become. I can tell you that I am not afraid of it, which for me is a considerable thing. She wrote, I think you sent me here, not in the way people mean when they say the dead arrange things. I don't believe that, and I don't think you would have either. But I think the life you lived made me into someone who could recognize what this place is, and that is a kind of sending. She stopped there. Read it back. Added one more line. I will light a candle tonight for both of them. For you because you deserve someone to know where it was pointed. And for him because he did what he did in December and then spent 8 years not knowing if it mattered. I will let him know in my way. I think it's time. She folded the letter. She paused before lighting it. Through the window, she could see the faint glow from the kitchen below. Emmett was still up his lamp, a thin line of yellow against the dark. She watched it for a moment. This man who had sat with 8 years of not knowing the way her father had sat with 8 years of nameless gratitude, both of them faithful to something they could not locate or measure or resolve. She held the corner of her letter to the candle flame and let it catch, and then held it over the tin dish she kept for this purpose and watched it go to ash. The night was clear. Through the window, the mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars, more stars than she had ever seen in her life before coming here. The kind of sky that requires a place with enough dark around it to show what's actually there. She came downstairs in the morning to find Emmett already at the stove as always, and the kitchen already warm as always, and the coffee already on as always. and she poured herself a cup and stood across from him and decided that the time for careful approach was finished. "I want to tell you about my father," she said. He turned. He looked at her with the full attention that was his way of indicating something mattered. "Not the letter," she said. "Not the history of it. I want to tell you about him. Who he was." Emmett set down the pot and leaned back against the counter with his arms loose at his sides, which was his way of making himself available to something without performing the making available. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about the small apartment on Fentiman Street where she had grown up, the one with the window boxes her mother had planted before she died, and which her father had continued to plant every spring marigolds, because those were what her mother had used, and he did not see a reason to change a thing that had been done well. She told him about the smell of the apartment pipe tobacco and wood stain, and the particular dusty warmth of a place that has been lived in steadily for many years. She told him about the commercial samples, the fabric swatches spread across the kitchen table in the evenings, her father explaining what each one was and where it came from, and what made it valuable, turning the commerce of textiles into a kind of geography lesson. A way of saying the world is bigger than this room and you should know its dimensions. She told him about the ledgers, how her father had taught her to keep them when she was 10. Not because it was necessary, but because he believed everyone should understand the logic of accounts. The way a balanced ledger requires both honesty and precision, and that these are not the same virtue, even though they are often confused. She told him about December of 1887, how her father had come home from Denver different, how the difference was not damage, but something closer to its opposite. A man who has been reminded of something fundamental and has decided not to waste the reminder. How he had not explained it to her. How he had only begun that winter to sit with a candle each evening for a few minutes before going about the rest of his night. He sat with it the way you'd sit with something you were grateful to, she said. Not religiously, not as a performance, just keeping company with a fact. Emmett had not moved from his position against the counter. His coffee had gone cold again, which happened when something occupied his attention fully. "I used to ask him what it was for," she said. "He would say it's for keeping faith. I thought that was a general answer. I thought he meant faith in the way people mean it when they're not being specific." She paused. "I was wrong. He was being completely specific. He just didn't have the information to be more precise." She looked at him. "He didn't know your name," she said. "He never knew, but he knew someone was out there and he thought about them every night for 8 years. And he was grateful every night for 8 years. And I think that is one of the most complete things I have ever known a person to do." The kitchen was very quiet. "He sounds like a man who knew how to carry a thing quietly," Emmett said. The way he said it made clear he was not speaking only of Dawson. "He would have wanted to tell you himself," she said. "He looked. He didn't know how. When he was dying, he told me he had one regret, and I didn't understand then what it was. I think I understand now." Emmett looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I didn't know if he'd lived," he said. "For 8 years, I didn't know. I told myself a man doesn't need to know the outcome of every decent thing he does. I told myself the act was sufficient in itself." A pause. "I believe that. I also know there's a difference between believing something and being free of wanting its opposite." He lived, she said. He raised a daughter and kept his accounts and planted marigolds every spring and lit a candle every night, and he was glad to be alive every day of it. I can tell you that with certainty. I watched him. Something moved through Emmett's face then. She had been watching his face long enough now to know the geography of it, to know where expression appeared first and where it resisted appearing. And what she saw was not grief and not quite joy, and not the simple relief she might have expected. It was something older and quieter than any of those things. The look of a man receiving information he had stopped expecting and finding that the receiving of it rearranges something in him that had been arranged around its absence. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "I'm glad he had you." She felt the words land somewhere precise. "I'm glad you stopped," she said, "on that road in December when you didn't have to. I'm glad you were the kind of man who stopped." He held her gaze. "Anyone would have." "No," she said, "they wouldn't." He lay there long enough that morning to know they wouldn't. The admission in this, what it conceded about that day, about the cold, about how long her father had been on the ground before Emmett came along, hung in the air between them, without heaviness, just as fact. Facts could be looked at directly. She had always believed, even the ones that were hard. Looking at them directly was the only way to be free of them. "I owe you something," she said. "I've thought about how to say this, and I don't have a better way than directly. I'm standing in this kitchen in this life because of what you did on a road in Colorado in December of 1887. I don't know how to not acknowledge that." He started to speak, and she held up her hand, not dismissively, but precisely. "I know what you'll say. That you didn't do it for any return. That you didn't know who he was, and didn't expect to. That the idea of owing and being owed is the wrong frame for it." She lowered her hand. "I agree with all of that. And I still want to say it plainly, because some things deserve to be said plainly, even if they can't be settled. My father was grateful to you every day for 8 years. I am grateful to you now. Not in a way that obligates me. I'm here because I chose to be here. And that is its own thing, separate and clear. But gratitude and choice can live in the same house without crowding each other out." He was very still. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. A long moment passed. The morning light was moving across the kitchen floor with its usual patience, the sun coming in through the east window and crossing the pine boards toward the far wall, inch by inch. Outside, Roy's wagon was on the road. She could hear it. And somewhere above the south pasture, the red-tailed hawks were beginning their morning rounds. Then Emmett said, quietly, "You asked me once why I wrote to you, when I knew your name. You answered. I answered part of it." He looked at her steadily. "The other part is harder to say." She waited. "I wrote to you because I had thought about that man in Denver for 8 years. And the only picture I had of him was a name in a notebook and the fact that he had a daughter he talked about when he was delirious." He paused. "He said she was gonna be all right. That she was practical and she didn't make decisions from fear. He said she was gonna be all right. And he said it 3 times the way people say the things they most need to be true." His voice was even and careful. I wanted to see if he was right. Clara looked at him for a long time. "Was he?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "I believe he was." Silas Holt came back to the ranch the following week. He came without a lawyer. He came in working clothes, not a town suit, which Clara noted when she saw him ride through the gate from the kitchen window. She did not go out. She understood without being told that this was a conversation for the two brothers to have alone. They were in the yard for a long time. She could not hear the words from where she was, but she watched the shape of the conversation through the window. Its long silences, its occasional gestures. The way both men stood with the particular combination of wariness and recognition that marks people who have known each other all their lives and have reached some agreement about what that knowing is worth. At one point, Silas took off his hat and looked at it for a while instead of at Emmett. She recognized this as the gesture of a man finding his way to something he hasn't quite said yet. Then they shook hands. It was not a demonstrative shake, not the grip of men who have resolved everything, but the grip of men who have agreed on a direction. That was enough. She had come to understand in this place that agreements made in plain language between people who mean them are more durable than demonstrations. Silas rode out without coming to the house. She did not take this as a slight. He had come for one specific purpose and had accomplished it, and excessive sociability was not apparently a Holt family trait. Nell Briggs came by that evening. She did not announce herself or need to. She came by when she came by. And by now this was simply a fact of life at the ranch. She brought a pie, which was her way of marking occasions without naming them. And they sat at the kitchen table with it, and with coffee, while the evening light went long and golden through the west windows. "I heard Silas came by," Nell said. "He and Emmett talked," Clara said. "Good." Nell applied herself to the pie with the satisfaction of someone whose calculations have proven correct. After a moment, she said, "George would have been pleased. He spent the last year of his life worrying about those two. He didn't want to go, leaving that between them. He didn't leave it. He left Emmett to deal with it." Clara poured more coffee, which is, I think, what he knew would happen. Nell looked at her. "You figured that out?" "George Holt sounds like a man who knew his sons well enough to know which one would find a way through," Clara said. "He left it to the right one." Nell was quiet for a moment in the way of a woman who has an opinion and is deciding whether offering it would be more service or interference. Then she said, "He also left it to the right one to find someone worth finding." She said this in the flat, direct manner she used for all things that mattered without emphasis or softening. Then she picked up her coffee cup and the moment passed. Later, after Nell had gone and the kitchen was quiet, Emmett came in from the barn. He washed his hands and poured himself the last of the coffee and looked at the pie, which had been mostly addressed. He sat down across from her at the table. "She say anything?" he asked. "She said your father would have been pleased." "She say anything about you?" "She was complimentary," Clara said. He looked at her. "What did she say exactly?" "She said you found the right one." She met his eyes. "I didn't correct her." A beat of quiet. Then his mouth moved the full version of the almost smile she had spent 2 months learning to read, which turned out to be in its complete form a very good smile. Plain and unforced and aimed directly at her. "No," he said. "I didn't either." That night, Clara brought the candle down from her room. It was a practical decision in the way that her best decisions tended to be. The stub she had been using upstairs was nearly finished, and the tin holder was better than the one in her room. and there was no real reason the candle needed to be upstairs rather than in the kitchen, where the light was more useful. She set it on the kitchen table in the center in its tin holder. Emmett was already there, his cup and his quietness arranged in their usual order. He looked at the candle. He looked at her. He said nothing. She sat down across from him. They sat with it the way two people sit with a thing they have arrived at separately and discovered they were already sharing without ceremony, without explanation, without any of the language that would have been required if the meaning of the gesture had needed to be constructed between them. It did not need to be constructed. It was already there, built out of December 1887, and 8 years of parallel evenings and 2,000 miles of country, and the particular confluence of practical needs and honest correspondence that had put them both in this kitchen, in these chairs, in this light. The candle burned. The mountains held their snow on the high faces. The creek ran in its banks below the east pasture. The horses moved in the dark corrals, with the slow and easy movement of animals that know themselves safe. The spring night was cold and clear, and full of stars, of the kind that require genuine darkness to see properly, and there was enough darkness out here to see all of them. After a while, Clara said, "He was right." Emmett looked at her. "My father," she said. "He told me I was gonna be all right." She looked at the candle. "He was right." Emmett looked at the candle, too. "He usually was. Usually." She paused. "He had good judgment about most things. He just didn't always know how to act on it. Most people don't." "No." She looked up. "You do." He considered this the way he considered most things, not dismissing it, not absorbing it too quickly. "Sometimes," he said. "December 1887, she said. He held her gaze. Then he said, with the simplicity that she had come to understand was his most complete form of expression, "He had a daughter. I wanted her to have her father." The candle flame moved in some small current of air. Neither of them had made bending and then straightening steady. "She did," Clara said, "for longer than she might have. Because of you." He was quiet. Then, "Does that settle it?" She thought about the question. She thought about what settling meant for a thing like this. Not the legal sense, not the financial sense, but the deeper sense of a debt paid, or a claim fulfilled, or a balance restored. She thought about what her father had been doing for 8 years, with his nightly candle not paying a debt, because there was no coin available for that transaction, but keeping faith with something that could not be resolved, only honored. "No," she said. "I don't think it settles. I think it just continues." He considered this. What does it continue into? She looked at him across the candle's light. "This," she said. "I think it continues into this." The word "this" was as plain a word as she had ever said, and held more in it than most sentences she'd constructed with deliberate care. It held the kitchen and the ranch and the work and the mornings. It held the garden and the fence line and the creek and the mountains. It held Nell and Roy and Silas's shaken hand, and George Holt's worry and Dawson Wren's marigolds and Augusta Fenner's careful letter. It held a road in Colorado in December, and a young man who stopped, and an older man who was found, and a daughter who came west on a train with a letter in her pocket that had gone soft at the folds. It held what was between them, which did not have a clean name yet, but which was real in the way the land was real honest, demanding, capable of yielding something worth having if you were willing to do the work of it. Emmett looked at the candle for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I expect it does." Outside, the night moved around the ranch in its great and indifferent way, full of distance and stars, and the long, cold breath of the mountains. Inside, the candle burned on the table between them, steady and plain and sufficient. The way a thing is sufficient when it is exactly what it needs to be, and nothing more, and nothing less. They sat with it until it burned down. Then they went about the rest of the evening, and the ranch sat quiet under its stars, and the creek ran in its banks, and the mountains held their snow against the coming of another spring. And somewhere out on the eastern pasture, a single meadowlark, mistaking the moonlight for the early sun, sang one clear phrase into the dark, and then went still. It was enough.